Alright, so this is much later than I would normally record on a Saturday, but it turns out I had some things that I was doing that took a little bit more time than I expected, right? Uh, I did release like 5 songs in one day, so I mean, to be fair, 3 of them are serving the same function, but all that considered, right? So, Mentis Wave dropped 2 videos that I'm pretty sure are going to be really interesting to me. So the first one is the hilariously insane irony of bimbo feminism, which I think I know what he's going to talk about here. But this is the one I want to catch on to because James Lindsay has done fine work, but he often, again, takes his work, as I've said in a previous video, in a more polemical direction that ends up undermining his case because then it's not rooted in objective reality, right? Uh, so let's see what's going on here. So this is refuting James Lindsay on Hoppe and general libertarianism. Now, I have my criticism of some libertarian, worldviews, especially the lolbertarian worldviews. But if you think libertarianism is just lolbertarianism, then that's a pretty quick indicator that you have no fucking idea what you're talking about, right? It's like if your only thought about conservatism is George W. Bush, it's pretty obvious that you have no idea what conservatism is, to be perfectly honest, right? So let's see what's going on here. Normally, I don't really try to react to Mentis Wave because oftentimes I agree with almost everything he says. It's just very rare where it's like, okay, yeah, this is not something that I agree with, but let's see what we got here. Because this is kind of interesting. This is an intersection of like 2 different people that I've learned a lot from.
Hey internets, so recently James Lindsay has been going off on libertarianism again, in a series of X-posts that can effectively be summarized as the meme. Well, if your ideology is correct, then why do I aggressively misunderstand what you actually believe?
This happens all the fucking time to people on the right in general, right? The quote-unquote right in general, right? But rightists do this to each other as well, and it is infuriating that like you deal with this from the left, and then a lot of these people will just turn around and do it to the people on the quote-unquote right, the anti-Marxist side, and it does get a little annoying, right? Being a libertarian, I have been told by people on the quote-unquote right, it's like, oh, well, you would never not side with the Democrats. And I've also been told by Democrats, oh, well, you would never not side with the Republicans. So it's like, it is kind of interesting when you like get hit from both sides of that conversation with the exact same complaint. Like, interesting. It's kind of interesting how that happens, right?
If you don't know who that is, he's the same guy who's behind the Grievance Studies affair, as well as the guy who's behind New Discourses. Which is actually pretty good work, to be honest. Which is why I'm going to be refuting these takes in good faith, also because a lot of what he has to say is really just standard general issues with libertarianism that your general standard conservative liberal types tend to have. And so
yeah, James Lindsay has done a good deal of work on, for example, communism. He's talked about like the history of fascism. He's talked about like all kinds of stuff. But communism is his big thing. He talks about like the Marxist underpinnings of queer theory. And when you're talking about intersectionality, his work is generally really good. When you step out of that particular frame, things get a little bit hectic real quickly. Right, he's the guy everyone was making fun of for the woke right idea, and it's like, look man, even if there are parallels between like how specific groups on the quote-unquote right act, they're not woke, right? You can't just expand the definition of woke in this particular way, otherwise you're going to destroy the meaning of the term, just like every other time where you unnecessarily expand the meaning of a term, right? So that was definitely a frustrating thing, because like I understood what he was saying and I agreed in some of the cases and I disagreed in other cases, but it's like it becomes an issue of like rhetorical, more rhetoric than it is really philosophy or like actual history or academia. So it's like it did get a little annoying with that. But he is the guy who introduced me to Hegelianism, and then I got to like actually, over time put all the pieces together in my brain. It's like, oh shit, I've read a lot of this stuff beforehand. This all sounds really similar, and it turned out it was really similar. It's like, oh, okay, okay, fair enough. Eric Voegelin is like where he got most of his ideas, except again he took the metaphysical substrate from Voegelin's work, and again he oftentimes uses it in more polemical ways, which in basically degrades his ability to actually objectively analyze the situation. Let's see.
So that's what this video really is going to be, is explaining a lot of the things about libertarian philosophy that people tend to get wrong. Because one white pill I've realized about libertarian philosophy is that a lot of standard conservatives who have problems with libertarianism, well, those contentions don't really come from a genuine dislike of libertarian theory. Rather, a lot of it comes from misunderstandings of the theory that is partially not entirely their fault. Part of it comes from people calling themselves libertarians despite not actually being so. Like, for example, left libertarians who are in fact just neo-Marxists who are basically bootlickers for the state, which then of course...
Yeah, this gets back to the thing I've said beforehand, where it's like the dialectical worldview will try to parasitize anything that it can get its hands on, right? And yeah, this has happened to libertarianism with the libertarian socialists and other ones. There are other dialectical libertarian movements, the ones that place the idea first and reality second. But the same thing happened in the conservative movement, right? What do you think the whole point with neoconservatism was, right? The whole idea of like exporting democracy, the conservative democracy, to all of these Muslim nations. Well, that wasn't going to work because it turns out they don't want that. And if you don't want that system, even if it works, it's not going to work if you don't want it, right? So it's like, yeah. The dialectical infiltration is actually really insidious because it is very, very infectious. So you have to keep in mind of your first principles to make sure that, again, the Gnostic parasite doesn't actually infect your particular movement, because that's one of the main goals it has, is to propagate itself, and it does so through parasitism.
Course causes confusion about libertarianism, because then the general conservatives might see that and they will incorrectly conclude that, oh, that means that the Mises Caucus is also a neo-Marxist movement, which is just completely incorrect. And so a lot of times when you set things straight and explain, no,
I mean, yeah, if you think that like the Mises Caucus of all fucking people are like Marxist or neo-Marxist, you have no fucking idea what you're talking about, right? The Mises Caucus is like the hardest of hardcore free marketeers, right? Just plain and simple. Like the the only harder core you might be able to get for like the free market is like the fucking the Ayn Rand Institute, right? Or like the Atlas Society, the followers of Ayn Rand. But like Hoppe was heavily influenced from Ayn Rand, which is why Ayn Rand and Hoppe didn't exactly get along with each other, because Hoppe didn't actually like cite that his source was a novelist, even though Ayn Rand wasn't just a novelist, she was also a accomplished metaphysician. So, and he had a basic understanding of the economy, right? It doesn't matter if you have formal training in it. If you're correct, you're correct, right? But yeah.
That's not what libertarian theory is. This is what libertarian theory is. A lot of times you can actually shake a neocon back to reality. So hopefully this video will answer a lot of questions that a lot of people tend to have about this philosophy, while also showcasing why a lot of otherwise very intelligent and well-educated people tend to fall for a lot of straw man arguments about what libertarian theory actually is. Anyways, let's get things started with misunderstanding Hans Hermann Hoppe. He writes, in case you wonder what's up with them, all these idiot libertarian accounts, Comic Dave Smith, Tom Woods, Libertarian Party, are huge devotees of noted Jew hater Hans Hermann Hoppe, who believed Marx was correct about everything. So yeah, starting off with a false accusation, along with a very severe misunderstanding of Hoppe's essay on Marxist and Austrian class analysis.
That would be like saying just because Ayn Rand actually agreed with some of the analytical, conclusions of Marx, which is true. You can find some like things that Ayn Rand has said, which completely out of context sound like something Marx would write, except for the fact that, like, again, even though they came to a similar conclusion, they have opposite answers to the conclusion that they have, right? One went very far left and one went very far right, right? So it's like, again, you could agree with someone on like the reality of a class analysis and then not agree with them on regards to what that actually means, right? So there's a difference between like the formal analysis and then the epistemology thereof and the ontology that's like implied there, right? So yeah, you could in theory agree with things like intersectionality in principle. I'll give you an example, right? Even though intersectionality is a Marxist spook, let's just agree, right? Like, just for the sake of conversation, like, everyone is the result of intersecting nodes of various identities, right? And that these have different, each one of these identities is either an oppressed or an oppressor class, right? Well, the problem is, let's just do this. First of all, if you do this, you're going to find that the majority of people actually aren't completely intersecting. No one is actually the same as the other, right? Because, like, you can apply this class analysis to fandoms, right? Creator versus the fans, right? Who has the power, right? You can do this to, for example, racial classes. You can do this, for example, linguistic classes. You can do this for sexuality classes, for, you know, sex classes, like male and female. You can do this for, like, let's see, hobbies in general, right? It doesn't even just have to be class analysis. You can apply this analysis to things like hobbies, personal experience, that kind of thing, right? Critical criminal studies is one example of the personal experience being applied to the Marxist class, conflict theory. If you do that, if you apply it to every aspect of human life, which is what the intersectional really says, then logically speaking, what you will find if you actually carry the math to its logical conclusion, which is why intersectionists do not do this. They have an arbitrary stop under their own mechanism to prevent you from coming to the logical conclusion. The logical conclusion of the intersectional analysis is that the individual themselves is actually the most oppressed class, and that it is the collective that is the oppressor of the individual. And if that sounds like it's actually counter-Marxism, it's because, yeah, the Marxists actually invented a social math system that actually just completely commits suicide if you take it to its logical conclusion. And they understand it commits suicide if you take it to its logical conclusion. So what do? They just don't take it to its logical conclusion. But you can weaponize that underlying weakness to show that this is, again, a completely disingenuous way to analyze everything, right? So there we have it right there. We have, just even agreeing with like what the leftist might say, we have still come to a fundamentally right-wing position, which is that of hyper-individualism, right? even though we've literally granted one of the leftist analytical positions. And yeah, like Ayn Rand does actually point this out, right? So like, even if Marx is actually right on some of his analysis, it doesn't mean what he extrapolates from it. And she shows how it doesn't mean what it extrapolates from there, right? So that's kind of interesting. And yeah, this is the kind of thing where if you've never actually read Hans Hermann Hoppe, I could see someone making this mistake, but it definitely shows that you didn't actually read Hans Hermann Hoppe if you genuinely think this.
Just start with the accusation of anti-Semitism. There is zero evidence that Hans Hermann Hoppe specifically and uniquely dislikes the Jews. Everything he has ever said in regards to ethnicity are general things painted with a broad brush, nothing actually specific. The only thing that comes close is that Hoppe has criticized Zionism and has criticized the Israeli government. But that doesn't count unless, of course, you go with what's called the new definition of anti-Semitism, where criticism of Israeli government policy is extended to all Jews, which
doesn't make any sense, in the same way that, like, criticism of the American government doesn't mean criticism of the American people, because the American people are not the government, right? A country and a nation and a state are different things. A country is the actual area. That's why we can talk about the old country, even if the government and the people are different, right? It's why, because we're not referring to the people or, like, the rulership, we're referring to the actual place, right? When you're talking about nations, why is it it's even logically possible to talk about stateless nations like the Romani or the Jews before the foundation of Israel, right? Well, it's because, again, a nation is the people, which is actually one of the reasons I made that whole video about the Marxists trying to obliterate Native American identity. I make that point very explicitly, right? And the state is just the governing body who has control over either a people or a region, right? So a country or a nation or both. And it's pretty easy how you could see criticizing one doesn't necessarily mean criticizing any of the other two things, right? You could criticize a local government, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're criticizing the local culture of the people. You're criticizing the government, because the government and the culture are two different things too, right? They can inform each other, but they're not the same thing. And it also just kind of, this whole idea that like criticizing Israel is inherently anti-Semitic kind of misses the point that like there were a lot of Orthodox Jews, and there still are Orthodox Jews who don't believe Israel is a legitimate state. Now, you can have whatever opinion you want on Israel, right? I don't really give a shit. But pretending as if criticism of Israel is inherently criticism of the Jews without actually showing the through line is not all that it's not all that compelling, to be perfectly honest. Are there people who do this who equivocate Jewry in Israel? Yeah, there are. We all know this. But just because someone is criticizing Israel doesn't mean that they're criticizing the Jews, right? Just it's a ridiculous thing, and it's something that, like, again, it kind of feels ridiculous that I have to point this out, because I'd like to think that most people have the intelligence to understand this implicitly, even if they may not necessarily have the linguistic distinction between a country, nation, and state in their head at all times, right?
Repeatedly shown to be a completely ridiculous argument. You can absolutely
also, like, right libertarianism was heavily influenced by Ayn Rand, whether Ayn Rand was kind of bitter about how some of her ideas were taken without credit, and to be fair, that's entirely reasonable. But Ayn Rand is a Jew, right? She's ethnic Jew from what I remember. So it's like, if you're anti-Semitic, that is a criticism of capitalism that is used by the third position, right? Is that Marxism and capitalism are actually both Jewish spooks. So, so it's like, okay, this everything I don't like is Judaism, apparently, right? But yeah, no, that was actually like a common critique among the precursors of the third positionists as well, was that, again, Marxism is a Jewish conspiracy and capitalism is a Jewish conspiracy, so you need a third position from between the two. So yeah. Accusing Hoppe of being anti-Semitic is kind of weird.
Criticize the government of a state without it counting as racism against the majority ethnicity that lives within that state. Like, for example, the CCP. People criticize the Chinese Communist Party all the time, and much of that criticism comes from Falun Gong, who, if you're familiar with them, are largely Chinese. And of course, there are many Jews who are critical of the Israeli government as well. This is
fair enough. I'm gonna read this because why the fuck not, right? But also, the thing about Falun Gong is there are real complaints to have about Falun Gong doctrine and practice. There really are. Not all of the claims about Falun Gong are actually Chinese propaganda. But at the same time, what the Chinese government did to Falun Gong is absolutely untenable, right? Two things can be true at the same time. Yeah, that is, he brings this up. It's actually kind of important he brings this up because, like, there are actually people in China who equivocate criticism of the Chinese government with criticism of China. So it's like, again, the Chinese do this exact same thing. Or at least many Chinese do this exact same thing. Okay, let's see what we got here. Contemporary Jewish organizations against Zionism. Neture Katara, or not, damn, I can't read right now. Neture Karta. Okay. Neture Karta is a religious group of Haredi Jews, that makes sense, founded in 1935 that actively opposes Zionism and advocates for the peaceful dismantling of the state of Israel. That is not happening. Even if Israel were to agree to terms, the peaceful dismantling is not going to happen. Not because of Israel, but, you know, refer back to the Hadith, right? They believe that the Jewish people are strictly forbidden from re-establishing sovereignty in the land of Israel until the arrival of the Messiah. And yes, this was actually one of the original complaints about the idea of establishing an Israeli state, was exactly this. It was the idea that you're trying to force the hand of God to move in history when God cannot be mocked and God cannot be controlled, right? Let's see. The group's members believe that the existence of a Jewish state is a rebellion against God, as it did not occur with divine intervention through the Messiah. That is correct. As a result, the Neture Karta are a regular site at pro-Palestinian protests in Europe and North America. Since the start of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, the group's spokesmen expressed their strong denunciation of the practices of the Israeli occupation army in Palestine. He stressed that the group opposes Zionism in all its forms and organizes demonstrations against the Israeli occupation while seeking to build bridges of reconciliation between Jews and Arabs. As long as Islam exists, that's not happening. Let's see. Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest progressive Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world. The organization describes itself as a grassroots, multiracial, cross-class, oh my god, intergenerational movement of U.S. Jews into, okay, I see what's going on here, into solidarity with the Palestinian freedom struggle, guided by a vision of justice, equality, and dignity of all people. Okay, yeah. Let's see. They have organized several pro-Palestinian campaigns, including Deadly Exchange, No Tech for Apartheid, and Not on Our Dime. Judas. Judas is a Jewish diaspora group based in London. It describes itself as a radical Jewish diaspora group and is known for its far-left anti-Zionism. It has a satirical communal website that stages events in London and elsewhere. Edda HaCharedis, let's see, the Haredi Council of Jerusalem is an ultra-Orthodox Jewish, it's in the name, group that believes the establishment of the state of Israel to be a rebellion against God. The group refuses to receive any state funding from the Israeli authorities or to endorse voting in elections, relying on donations from fellow anti-Zionist Haredi Jews abroad and in its own income. International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. The International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, IJAN, is a network of anti-Zionist Jews pledged to oppose Zionism in the state of Israel. The IJAN views Zionism as a racist movement and Israel as an apartheid state. The charter of the organization states, "We are an international network of Jews who are uncompromisingly committed to the struggle for human emancipation, of which the liberation of the Palestinian people and the land is an indispensable part. Our commitment is to the dismantling of Israeli apartheid and the return of Palestinian refugees, the ending of the Israeli colonization of historic Palestinians." Oh, and the ending of, okay. So a lot of Jewish anti-Zionists are on the left, but there are actually like right-wing anti-Zionists in the Jewish community as well. It's just the left-wingers are the most vocal and they get the most attention.
A textbook example of the fallacy of division. Just because someone is criticizing one part does not mean they're criticizing the whole part. But of course, this is just an ex post, and Lindsay didn't elaborate on why he believes that Hoppe.
It's like, to give another example, it's like you can criticize, for example, how the Catholic Church handled specific scandals, but you're not necessarily criticizing any individual Catholic, or you're not criticizing the church in and of itself, right? You're criticizing a particular policy, which is different from criticizing the existence of an institution even, right? So all of this is like, you got to remember what the context of the criticism is and what the actual target of the criticism is, because people will use these equivocations to try to manipulate your position in a conversation, right? So be mindful of that.
Is a notorious Jew hater or something. But regardless of whether it's the new definition of anti-Semitism or believing that he's genuinely said anti-Jewish things, both of them are false for different reasons. So let's just move on to...
Okay, I want to go back here because we didn't read the actual tweet. Okay, so let's read the tweet. So this is from the Journal of Libertarian Studies, Volume 9, Number 2, Fall 1990. This is what James Lindsay himself is quoting. Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis by Hans Hermann Hoppe, Department of Economics, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I want to do the following in this paper. First, to present the theses that constitute the hard core of the Marxist theory of history. I claim that all of them are essentially correct. Then I will show how these true theses are derived in Marxism from a false starting point. Finally, I will demonstrate how Austrianism, in the Mises Rothbard tradition, which is a base tradition, can give a correct but categorically different explanation for their validity. I think I talked about this I think I gave the example of like intersectionality earlier, right? Let me begin with the hard core of the Marxist belief system. 1. The history of mankind is the history of class struggles. I don't agree with that, but okay. It is the history of the struggles between a relatively small ruling class and a larger class of the exploited. The primary form of exploitation is economic. The ruling class expropriates part of the productive output of the exploited, or as the Marxists say, it appropriates a social surplus product and uses it for its own consumptive purposes. The ruling class is unified by its common interest in upholding its exploitive, and then it cuts off from there. But they're not entirely wrong. It's like what he's talking about here is like taxation, right? There's a ruling class that literally exists by parasitizing off of you, by taking literally your, again, if you know, your time, if you work hourly, your productivity, if you work commission, your availability, if you work sales, and like, again, people's belief in your work if you're working based off of patronage. They're telling you again, it's like that which you have earned does not actually belong to you, it belongs to me. We just get to let you have some of the material. But yeah, no, the tax policies really are just a legalization of theft. That's all they are. So he's not entirely wrong about this, and Lindsay just didn't seem to read past the beginning, because I can already tell where they're moving. But, you know.
When these said anti-Jewish things, both of them are false for different reasons. So let's just move on to the next and honestly more interesting problem, which is thinking that Hoppe is saying that Marx is correct about everything here. This is a perfect example of why you can't just read the first page of an essay and assume that you understand the essay from that first page. Because if you actually read Hoppe's entire essay on Marxist and Austrian class analysis, you will realize that the first page of it is actually bait. Because it first appears that Hoppe is saying that the Marxist theory of history is completely correct, claiming that you can, in fact, describe history in terms of class rule, class struggle, and exploitation. But there's a...
Yeah, it was pretty obviously bait. Hold on. Let's see what we get here. It looks like we have more of the text to read here. Hold on. Okay, here we go. We were here. Number 2. The ruling class is unified by... Wait. Yeah, okay. So the ruling class is unified by its common interest in upholding its exploitative position by maximizing its exploitative appropriated surplus product. It never deliberately gives up power or exploitation income. Fuck. Instead, any loss in power or income must be wrestled away from it through struggles whose outcome ultimately depends on the class consciousness of the exploited, i.e., on whether or not and to what extent the exploited are aware of their own status and are consciously united with other class members in common opposition to exploitation. 3. Class rule manifests itself primarily in specific arrangements regarding the assignment of property rights, or, in Marxist terminology, in specific regulations of production. In order to protect these arrangements or production relations, the ruling class forms and is in command of the state as the apparatus of compulsion and coercion. The state enforces and helps reproduce a given class structure through the admission of the system of class justice, and it assists in the... and then the page cuts out again.
Class struggle and exploitation. But
I love how he has to highlight this. But I think everyone who actually heard me talk probably heard me say this, right? I want to do this in the following paper. Fucking highlighted. First, to present the theses that constitute the hard core of the Marxist theory of history, I claim that all of them are essentially correct. That's the part he has highlighted, because it's the only part that seems to have stood out when Lindsay actually read this paper, if he read it at all, because he misses the literal next part. Then I will show how these true theses are derived in Marxism from a false starting point. Finally, I will demonstrate how Austrianism and the Murray-Rothbard tradition can give a correct but categorically different explanation of their validity. Of their validity. So again, this happens all the time. Believe it or not, this actually happens all the time. One of my favorite examples is like Arthur Schopenhauer, because Arthur Schopenhauer actually has an entire section in his writings where he actually defends like pedophilia morally, And everyone gives him shit for this, except for the fact that if you actually read literally the paragraph before that essay, he actually tells you this is bait. You don't have anything to hit me with, so I'm gonna give you something as a free shit, like as a free like thing to sling at me. But he doesn't actually believe it. He literally used that as a tool to see whether or not someone's paying attention. Believe it or not, philosophers have done this all throughout history. All those people who got like convinced that Atlantis was real based on the works of Plato. Yeah, I hate to tell you this, but like a lot of that is Plato just checking to see if you're actually paying attention, and if you're actually thinking critically, or if you're just you're just fucking nodding your head, to be perfectly honest, right? That's the whole fucking point of the
there's a very important part of
the whole point of like the whole Atlantis story is not this is actually what happened, but it is a retard detector in the tradition, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, that's exactly what Schopenhauer was doing when he wrote that. It's like, this is a retard detector. Did you actually read the fucking book? Or did you zero in on something that even in context is not what it says, not what you're saying it is, right? So yeah, those are just some of my examples. Another example is like Kierkegaard, when he said in order to save Christianity he had to abandon Christianity. It's like, okay, but if you read the rest of the text, you can see, oh, this is like bait text. Like, happens all the fucking time. I'm telling you, like, all throughout history, philosophers and many academics have had these kinds of, I'm gonna bait the retard sections in their works, and it works. Very consistently, the retards are baited, right? But yeah, this is very clearly bait from Hoppe.
That people who are just skim reading this or assuming they understand it from the first page are completely missing, which is hinted at right here. Hoppe writes, I will demonstrate how Austrianism in the Mises Rothbard tradition can give a correct, but categorically different explanation of their validity, that they are derived in Marxism from a false starting point. So just a little English comprehension 101 here. This kind of negative framing means that the only thing Hoppe is handing to Marxism is that human society does have parasites in it that do engage in some kind of exploitation. But he's not actually agreeing.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree that this is really class conflict type, like, I wouldn't agree with that, but, I could see how, like, you could agree with the wording in there, but, that's neither here nor there.
With Marxists and how specifically those things are defined. What's going on here is that Hoppe is writing it this way with it in the first page, just to, again, bait Marxists into reading it. See, the thing you have to understand about Hoppe, something I noticed when reading a lot of his work, is that Hoppe views Marxism as a false cure. The fundamentals of Karl Marx, at their core, is really just the recognition that something is wrong with society. That there are people out there who are doing things to others that can arguably be seen as objectively evil and wrong, and yet our society accepts it anyways, and this acceptance is part of the reason why modern society.
Well, that's unfortunate. It seems that my what the fuck is going on?
Still has a lot of problems, and because Marxists misidentify.
Hold on, let me do something. Hopefully this doesn't kill my fucking quality anymore. Hold on. That should fix that problem. I just turned something off in the background, so hopefully that fixes that.
By what specifically that problem is. They create an entire philosophy that is essentially nonsensical, but at the same time very attractive, because it gives people an explanation for why certain things are a certain way, that answers a lot of questions that a lot of people have about why society seems so unfair at times. And you can...
I mean, this is the whole point with, like, the whole, like... This is the whole thing with, like, again, I've talked about beforehand how, like, these Gnostic-inflected ideologies, they have to make you believe that being inside, or at least the reality around you, is evil, right? And the way that you can do this is by pointing out some objective wrong with, the society around you, and hyper focusing on that, right? Or pointing out something legitimately wrong in society and then providing a false framing to magnify it, or to change how it actually operates in the real world. And this is exactly what Marxism does. In fact, this is how many cults operate, right? They find something that may be lacking, and then they overly sell on that particular issue, even though they don't actually have a method with which to solve the problem. They only want you to have control over you. So all they have to do is, again, sell you that there is a problem, and then sell you that they have the solution to the problem. They don't actually have to have the solution to the problem. They have to just make you believe you have the solution to the problem. And once you have sold on someone that they have a problem in their life, especially if they didn't know that problem existed in the first place, which is what a lot of these intersectional movements do, is they aggravate a issue that people just didn't have an issue with beforehand, and then they make that into an issue in the person where beforehand they were just completely unbothered by it, right? So, yeah, it's a special kind of evil snake oil salesman, but yeah.
See this right away in his essay again on the second page. Hoppe writes, unfortunately, however, it is Marxism which subscribes to all of them in regards to all of these theories of exploitation and class that has done more than any other ideological system to discredit their validity. Or in other words, what Hoppe is saying here in regards to class and exploitation is defined completely differently than what Marxists are talking about. You see, Marxists define exploitation as through the process of extracting what they call surplus labor value, which of course relies on the labor theory of value, that it's entirely...
Which, by the way, is not a serious method of economics.
created off the back of the worker. And so thus they see it as when the product of the worker's labor is, say, $100 in value, and the boss only pays the worker $20, then it is said that the boss has stolen roughly $80 from him. That's effectively how Marxists see it. That's a very basic rudimentary concept of LTV anyway. In this view, the boss takes advantage of the fact that they own the means of production in order to exploit the worker, viewing it as no different as the system of slavery of old, other than the fact that it's been privatized. Now, Hoppe very strongly disagrees with this theory and actually just calls it patently absurd. Reading further into the essay, Hoppe points out that the reason the worker agrees to this kind of arrangement is because his wage payment represents present goods, while his own labor services represent only future goods. And so what Hoppe is really talking about here is just the phenomenon of time preference, and recognizing that time itself has a value and that generally future goods are not worth the same as a present good. For example, if you had the choice given right now to be given a house for free immediately, or to be given a voucher which will give you the same house for free again in another 10 years from now, which will you pick? Will you pick to have the house for free, or will you pick to have the house, the same exact house, you know, no tricks here? Would you rather have the same exact house for free in 10 years instead of now? Well, obviously, you'd rather have it now, as that represents 10 additional years of being able to use it. But it also makes sense from the standpoint of investment. Would you rather be paid $100 now, or would you rather be paid $100 5 months from now? Well, obviously, it's of course more valuable to you now. And the fun thing about this comes up when you consider the fact that you can auction these things off. Auction a product off worth whatever value, and then auction a voucher off for the exact same product. And of course, what's going to happen is every single time, pretty much, the prospect of having it now will auction off for a higher price than the price of a voucher that will entitle you to the exact same product later. And you can see the difference in that value increase as the amount of time increases. Make it a year for the voucher, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. As you go higher and higher, the value of that voucher will decrease, especially if you increase the time so much that it extends beyond the average lifetime of a human lifespan. Then the voucher becomes almost near worthless, except for those who would wish to will it to their offspring. And so going back to the factory worker and, say, the factory owner, the typical case that the Marxists will complain about, really the factory worker is agreeing to work under these conditions so that the worker does not have to take the time, the risk, and the investment, and the time for all of that to pay off to go and build his own factory. And that therefore comparing this relationship to that of the slave and the master is invalid, because the relationship of the worker and the factory owner is in fact a mutually beneficial one.
So I actually really like this example. This is actually a really fucking good example. This is why I love Mencius Wave. Because yeah, like people, it always does bother me. It's like people like to point out the exploitation sometimes, like with bad bosses, right, of like workers, and you know sometimes it does happen, but people don't really have the same degree of compassion when a good employer is taken advantage of by a bad worker, which happens all the time. This is one of the reasons why I don't particularly care for unions. I am actually related to people who used to work to represent unions, and my view of unions has been tainted as a result of that, because I've been told exactly what that entails, And fuck these people. But what's that old joke? What's that joke? It's like it's easy to hate the rich, but are you brave enough to hate the poor? Anyway, as a poor, I can agree. But anyway, where was I going with this? It's like, again, the employer doesn't just like sit on a pile of money and do nothing. The employer is usually doing real work behind the scenes, right? He has to comply with the regulations. He has to comply with the laws. He has to make sure all the supplies are coming in. He has to make sure all of the people are actually doing their job. There's a lot of things that go on for like the upper layers of the company that actually have to be done. And as a result, because they actually have to be done, it ends up, needing to be paid for as well, right? You don't want this work to be free. You're not going to do it for free. Why would you expect them to do it for free, right? So they have to be compensated for something for their work as well, right? So it's like 100% of the proceeds can obviously not go to the fucking laborers, because then what is the coordinator of the labor going to actually be incentivized? What's going to incentivize them to work? And oftentimes the Marxists will have some lofty fucking idealism behind it, and it's like, I thought you people were, allegedly like materialists. But anyway, but yeah, so it's like the relationship between an employer and an employee is mutually beneficial usually, or at least that's what it should be. You can find people who are genuinely exploitative. But I'm going to tell you this, a lot of those people who are genuinely exploitative are people who do things like hire illegal aliens, right? Because then they can take the fucking they can take the fucking, they can hold the fact that, like, again, they're illegal, and so therefore shouldn't be in the country. They can hold that over their head, because if they leave, well, then the employer can just report them for being an illegal and get them potentially arrested and deported. So yeah, there's that. But yeah,
This is not agreeing with what Marx had to say at all. It's actually a direct refutation of it.
I pull this shit all the time in conversation. Like, I will simply grant someone a premise just so that I can show that their premise does not actually go to the place that they want it to go. I've done this shit multiple times. It's actually one of my favorite tactics, is to get someone to explain what they believe and then actually critically analyze what they believe and show that it actually doesn't go to the place they want it to go, right? I had a conversation actually with a gentleman about, for example, funny enough, whether or not under the Christian worldview, then again, we're just using this as an example of like what Hoppe is doing, but in a different field, right? The question about like whether Unitarianism or Trinitarianism was true, because I was talking to a oneness Pentecostal, and I was the first one to figure out we were talking to a oneness Pentecostal, and I was pointing out, it's like, okay, so love is the greatest property of God, right? So that is a property of God. So God would still love even sans creation. So even if God never chose to create, because that is part of his power, he doesn't need creation. If he decided not to create, it's a thing he could have done, he would still be loved, right? And then obviously they agreed to that, right? And I pointed out, well, that doesn't make any sense, because love is by definition other oriented, right? Love is by definition willing the supreme good of another. It's not an emotion, it's a decision. It is a capacity of a character. So God cannot actually be loving if he's a Unitarian God sans creation. In fact, he needs creation if he's a Unitarian God, because if he is love, then he is willing the supreme good of another in his very nature. But if there is no other, then that's not true of God. So God is either mutable in time, in which case he did not create time, he was actually subject to time, or he's actually multi-personal. Because again, if God by his very nature is love, then his nature is defined by his relation to creation. But if Unitarianism is true, but if God is multi-personal, like three persons of a Trinity, then even sans creation, God is still love, because there are three eternal, persons in that single essence, in that single being, that are able to know and love each other sans time. So that's another example of like, we'll just grant a premise and then show that that's not actually how that moves from, because like the oneness Pentecostal idea is that Jesus Christ is actually the Father, and he is the Holy Spirit, and the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are actually just different roles that this one God with this one person in his being plays in the cycle of history. And I was pointing out, it's like, okay, we will grant you the thing that you were talking about earlier, right? Which is God is love, because we had that part in the conversation. It's like, okay, now let's show how this actually undermines your entire point, right? I love doing this kind of stuff, but I'm usually pretty polite on people who are actually like genuinely good-hearted people. I can be pretty fucking mean when I'm dealing with someone I think is an actual cunt. But so it's like I'm usually a lot meaner when I talk to Marxists about this stuff. And I'm a lot meaner when I'm using examples from like Islam, because again, I think these are evil ideologies. But yeah, so that's basically no more than what Hoppe is doing. He's just doing this to Marxism.
Why you need to read the whole article sometimes. It becomes very obvious at this point why Hoppe wanted to bait Marxists in.
What? Okay, that's funny.
To reading this. Because the thing is, if you know Marxists, you know that they really hate to read any kind of theory that goes against their own dogma. And so what Hoppe's really done here is he's tricked them into reading a refutation of their theory by kind of pretending to agree with them at the start. But then, of course, he's only agreeing with it in so as far as their basic rhetoric. But he's actually completely disagreeing with how they define class and how they define exploitation. And since those things are at the heart of what Marxism is, because the theory effectively falls apart without Marx's class theory and without the labor theory of value, this is definitely not Hoppe thinking that Marx was correct about everything. Very far from it. It is, again, as I said earlier, bait. And so then the question becomes, okay,
yeah, a lot of libertarian authors do this kind of stuff, but a lot of authors in general do this kind of stuff. It's not just in libertarianism. A lot of philosophers will do this exact kind of bait for this exact purpose, right? To get people to read something that they wouldn't have otherwise read, and then potentially change their mind after deconstructing a belief that they had in their head prior to reading this, and then again seeing that what they believed was the necessary conclusion to that belief actually doesn't follow at all.
Okay, well, what is Hoppe proposing as an alternative to this theory? Well, in regards to exploitation, Hoppe writes that exploitation is the expropriation of homesteaders, producers, and savers by late-coming non-homesteaders, non-producers, non-savers, and non-contractors. Or in other words, it's about property rights, people whose claims to property are derived from thin air and who disregard others' work and contract. You know, kind of like a thief, or a murderer, or let's say an army of barbarians coming into a village to use force and violence to extract the goods by which they created without any kind of voluntary contract involved. Which...
yeah, it's the parasite class, you know, the thing that's set up by the use of force doctrine to explicitly justify. Just pointing that out there, right?
Actually does make sense to define human history of conflict by this, because he's defining exploitation by the very act of creating conflict. And through this theory of exploitation, we also derive a completely different theory of class. What Hoppe's alluding to here is effectively known as the non-productive class theory. Whereas instead of simply looking at class as a case of owners and workers, or a divide between the rich and the poor, instead we're looking at a divide from people who get their resources through voluntary interaction and people who get their resources from non-voluntary interaction. Assuming that you are an honest citizen, most of the goods that you have in your home are probably things that you voluntarily worked for and voluntarily bought. Most of them, at least. And a thug who then breaks into your home to steal those goods is thus extracting the product of your work without your voluntary consent. That, in essence, is the non-productive class. And yes, that, in essence, is also the human history of conflict. Just about every...
I mean, it's not just them. It's also, for example, the taxman, right? The taxman is not part of the productive society, class. He doesn't actually produce anything. His entire role is to expropriate, to extract from the productive class to give to a non-productive class. And then, for example, well, who does the taxman ultimately fund, especially nowadays, right? Well, the welfare state, for example, like it's sometimes called the parasite class for a reason, right? You got these people, many of whom could work, even if they wouldn't necessarily like the job that they have, instead of actually working, actually producing something, actually, earning their, earning the food and earning their, a place of residence. fucking mooch off society, right? Just, it really is that simple, right? It's just like, again, like, it's easy enough to hate the rich. Are you, because of like the things that they do? Are you brave enough to hate the poors? Because the poor, who are the welfare parasites, I'm not saying all the poor is the welfare parasites, poor a part of the who are part of the welfare parasites, guess what? They will always vote for give me more Gibbs. Don't make me produce anything. Give me more Gibbs. Make my life more comfortable while I provide nothing of value to the society through any kind of economic effort, right? So it is more than just thieves and robbers, but you know, it is you know, thieves and robbers are definitely part of it.
Every single conflict in human history can be defined by this type of criminal behavior, in one way or another, scaled to various degrees. And you will also notice that this kind of class theory scales starting from the individual. It is not a necessarily collectivist class theory, and thus does not require any belief in any sort of collective guilt. It is instead rooted almost entirely at the level of whether or not a person uses aggression to get what they want, or if they're offering their goods and services freely only to those who agreed to pay for them.
Yeah, that's another thing you'll notice. The class theory, like the whole point of this is, again, to gut class theory from the inside using its own mechanisms. And here we have classes defined not by some kind of social characteristic, you know, that's extrinsic to the person, like whether or not they're bourgeois or proletariat, whether or not they're male or female, whether or not they're queer or normative or, you know, normal, whether or not they're BIPOC or fucking, you know, white, whether or not they are healthy or, you know, fat, whether or not they're abled or disabled, whether or not they are a criminal or a law-abiding, right? All of these different groups that are subject to their own versions of, like, again, Marxist class struggle analysis. No, these, again, it's a cast of characters right here. It even says it right there on the thing. The class that we're talking about is based off of the character of the person, how they actually behave, right? How they conduct themselves in their life, not some, again, predetermined assumptions based off a person, but rather what they actually do. Because there's nothing stopping the bourgeois from a bourgeois person from being just as benevolent as someone in the proletariat, right? Just pointing that out there. There's nothing actually stopping someone who happens to be BIPOC from being a virtuous person. We have plenty of, you know, quote unquote BIPOC saints in the Roman Catholic Church from before, you know, the Marxists tried to subvert the Roman Catholic Church in the Cold War. Just point of fact, right? We have, again, you know, plenty of saints who are also white, right? None of these seem to be all that important. We have plenty of saints that are, again, male, plenty of saints that are female. We have saints that were abled. We have saints that were disabled. Just, you know, none of these classes mean anything in the moral life, to be perfectly honest. But whether or not you are a thief or whether or not you're actually productive is actually part of, you know, inextricably linked to the moral life, right? So there is that. So this is a better class conflict theory than anything the Marxists could have ever come up with. The question of the exploitative who, again, extract, you know, from the productive class, but the productive class are the people who actually go out there and do, you know, business, basically, right? They actually provide a service or a good to the people around them. They don't just have to say, I have bigger stick, therefore it is mine. And then, you know, just pretend as if, you know, they're not subject to any kind of moral consideration because they have bigger stick, right? Which is the logical consequence of certain ideas that are floating around right now.
This is a class theory that's rooted in the thinking of some old French philosophers and some Austrian philosophers who are ultimately mostly free market thinkers. So again, another very big way that Hoppe is disagreeing with Marx. Because from this difference in opinion between what specifically exploitation and what specifically class is, and how these things cause conflict, the major differences between the Austrian school and neo-Marxists today is that neo-Marxists are socialists, while those of the Austrian school are free marketeers, heavily in favor of capitalism. And
so the Austrian school and the Chicago school actually have their roots in the school of Salamanca, which is actually, I think, if I remember correctly, the same ideological root of like the Wealth of Nations, right? the School of Salamanca being a proto-free market, school in the history of the Catholic Church. A lot of the ideas that would eventually develop into free market economics do come specifically from the School of Salamanca. So the free market is a Catholic idea, funny enough.
See this today in the progressive neo-Marxist movement, where most of them generally just vote for increased regulation and increased taxes to pay for entitlements, strangling the market with the hands of the state. Whereas the Austrian school actually views the state itself as members of the non-productive class, due to the fact that taxation is theft. And so thus it is argued that there needs to be less state involvement, as the very existence of the non-productive class incentivizes the existence of corruption, and that the more capitalism is clean of this, the better it functions, which, by the way, has historically been proven to be correct. Hoppe.
Yeah, I don't even know how you would, even in theory, like, argue against this, right? Like, how would you actually just, like, argue against this in principle and not come off as being disingenuous, right?
Calls this clean capitalism, and we can clearly see that this is what he is arguing by this statement right here. Hoppe writes, competition within the ruling class and among different ruling classes brings about a tendency towards increasing concentration. Marxism is right in this, however, its faulty theory of exploitation again leads it to locate the cause for the tendency in the wrong place. Marxism sees such a tendency as inherent in capitalist competition, yet it is precisely so long as people are engaged in a clean capitalism that competition is not a form of zero-sum interaction. The homesteader, the producer, saver, and contractor do not gain at another's expense. Or to put everything very simply, TLDR, Hoppe is basing his class theory on those who are criminals and those who are not, and exploitation is more on the very act of expropriation of property that is not rightfully yours. Which of course it also comes with a completely different ethical theory. So very totally different from what Marx was saying. Which,
I mean, yeah, I think it's a pretty fair assessment of what they were, I think it's a pretty fair assessment of, again, Lindsay not actually reading more than what seems to be the summary of the fucking article. Oh my goodness.
then allows us to move on to the next thing that Lindsay had to say. Taking something said by Texas and Cap. Ah yes, governments wanting to control more of the world so they manufacture threats to justify war. To which Lindsay replies by comparing that to other various cringe theories, who kind of say something similar, like communists also saying, ah yes, capitalists and imperialists wanting to control more of the world so they manufacture threats to justify war, and how CRT and feminists and third worldists, Palestinians, and critical America theory, I guess, all say very similar things, accusing their boogeyman of wanting to control more of the world, and thus they manufacture threats to justify war. However, this is a false comparison, and for a very simple reason, which is that the libertarians are correct. And the comparison is faulty, because the problem with all the others is that they're looking at largely through a collectivist framework, whereas the libertarian is looking at it from the perspective of identifying the incentive structure of how the non-productive class works, and how that happens at an individual level. So for example, feminists accusing men of manufacturing threats to justify war to control the world is incorrect, because there's no specific incentive for quote-unquote the men or the patriarchy to actually do this. And also, as I pointed out in one of my previous videos of the collectivist fallacy, the collective mind of the men is not a concretely real thing. However, when it comes to government, we're not really talking about the government as a collective, but rather just their participation in the non-productive class. You see,
yeah, I mean, again, he is once again right that, again, the collective class consciousness is not actually anything that exists in concrete reality. It is an abstraction that's treated as if it's more real than the concrete reality they find themselves in, because they don't want to live in a concrete reality. They want their abstractions to be true, so they will negate the real in order to manifest that abstraction into reality, or at least to force people to pretend as if it's real, when we all know that it doesn't actually work, but they will still try it because this is what these people fucking do.
An issue when it comes to war and the state is that there is a conflict of interest which allows them to profit off of war. The way it works in the United States, at least, is that the government funds the private and name-only production of military weapons and supplies, all on taxpayer dime, which, again, taxation is theft. And then through having a revolving door relationship with those companies, individual politicians are then able to join in and reap the profits. And thus, an incentive is born for our politicians to justify war. They have to justify it by having a regular need to use and produce these weapons. as well, of course, the incentives of controlling different regions. But this incentive structure is generally what's often called the military-industrial complex, which ordinarily this wouldn't really be that profitable, but because taxpayer funds do not need to be voluntarily forfeited, the government is able to push a much larger amount of funding towards it, allowing them to fund trillions of dollars into a project without people really understanding what's going on and just how much money is being wasted.
Yeah, it's not just the military-industrial complex. It's also, again, the welfare state drains a huge fraction of the American productivity as well. So it's like a large part of your productivity is stolen through taxes to fund people who oftentimes can but just won't fucking work. And then oftentimes it'll be funded into, again, these military operations that aren't really about anyone in particular's good as much as it is just, again, laundering money. Think about like the Clinton campaign in the fucking in Haiti, which was in retrospect very obviously almost almost certainly a money laundering scheme, to be perfectly honest, or involved some kind of laundering in that case. That's not that hard to grasp. But yeah, there's also the thing of like about the taxation thing. There's also the thing of you can tell that like the Marxists are not actually being genuine in some of the things that they're saying, especially about like the class conflict stuff, because you have to ask the question, okay, if money is evil, if it is mammon, right? If it is actually evil, then why do you want it, right? If money is evil, then why do I have to give my money to you so that you can use it? It doesn't seem like it's actually intrinsically evil at all. It just kind of sounds like you want to use it, and that's the key. Money actually is not evil. A disordered love of money would be evil. Yeah, fair enough. We have a word for that. But money in and of itself is not evil. It's actually an intrinsic good because it's a medium of exchange. It facilitates the flow of goods and services in a way that is actually more sophisticated and intuitive than bartering, for example, right? But that being said, there is an underlying ethical presupposition in the Marxist worldview, which is, and it's not just the Marxist worldview, it's any of these worldviews that support, for example, a welfare state. Because you have to ask yourself again the question, why don't I get to keep my money? Why does someone who didn't have to work get my money, right? Why is it the thing that you're telling me is evil, instead of being destroyed, is just given to someone else? Well, ultimately speaking, it's because Marxism and its descendant ideologies, even Nazism and fascism, because those are descendant ideologies of Marxism, they carry the Marxist logic with them, just applied in different fields. They are all worldviews of envy. Every single one of them. The class conflict that is used in these worldviews are class conflicts that are ultimately envious. They are actually envious of the alleged oppressor, which is part of the reason why they hate the alleged oppressor so much. But in the case of the Marxist, it's pretty obvious to see because there's this self-replicating asset, which is capital, and each of these models have their own self-replicating asset that is allegedly a bane on society, but that has to be redistributed even though it's a bane on society. And in the case of Marxism, it's capital. So it's like, okay, if capital is evil, why do I instead of destroying capital, why do I have to give capital to someone who didn't work for it? Oh, wait a minute, there's a reason why, and it's because you as a producer don't actually deserve to have anything that you produce. It really is that simple. It is an envy of the people who are actually able to produce something in their life, and as a result, to take away the work of the sweat of your brow, the product of your work, which would be your capital, is the function by design of the communist. And again, what was that line in BioShock that actually turns out to be entirely fucking correct, even though they appended it to a villain, even though he is actually unironically correct? It's like, to who does the sweat of a man's brow, belong to? Does it belong to him? No, says the man in, says the Soviet. It belongs to the man in Moscow. No, Says the American. It belongs to Washington. No, says the Vatican. It belongs to God, right? Again, nothing you actually work for, nothing you produce actually belongs to you, because you aren't a real self-sufficient individual. You are just a member of a collective body, and since you are a productive member of that collective body, you are a cancer on the collective body, which is why you have to be excised, right? And this is why you're not a part of which is why you're not part of the class, right? You could think of like the proletariat as being a sort of immune system of the societal body, and then the bourgeoisie and capitalism as being the cancer. That's why they don't have a plan to negotiate with the bourgeoisie, only a plan to overthrow and kill them, right? So yeah, the whole idea undergirding Marxism is that the man who produces does not actually deserve what he produces because he is a producer. And the reason why is because, again, he is the communist is the greediest fucking person you will ever meet. What you own does not belong to you, it actually belongs to him. Anyway.
People will argue that this is a conspiracy theory, but there are two major problems with that claim. The first is just that no one can deny that the incentives I just mentioned are objectively real incentives. If you are a politician and you have a financial stake in a private company that effectively earns profits off of the existence of war, then you ultimately have the incentive to exaggerate the need for war. Now, this alone wouldn't necessarily be proof of the military-industrial complex and its issues. We, of course, also need a smoking gun, which brings us to the second issue of calling it a conspiracy theory, which is that we can ask ourselves a very simple historical question, which is the question of, okay, have the government officials in this specific position exaggerated the needs for war in the past? And the answer, very sadly, is absolutely yes. For example, it is now known that the Lyndon B. Johnson administration misled people about the justifications for the Vietnam War, primarily how the August 4th attack just didn't really happen. And then, of course, there's the Iraq War. I think we all kind of still remember that one. There were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction found. Iraq was just a paper tiger the whole time. And then...
Okay. So Iraq is also a bad example here, because, yeah, sure, maybe there are no weapons of mass destruction that were found. There was still an actual genocide of Kurds going on, right? So, like, if you agree with military action to save the Jews in the Second World War, or you agree with military action for the purposes of saving the Christians in the First World War from the Ottomans, right? So to give you two different examples, right? If you support either one of those, well, the same logic would also apply to potentially saving the Kurds from the genocide that they were experiencing under Iraq, which was a real thing, whether or not they were using chemical weapons. So this one might not necessarily be the best example. There was no call for war in the sense of like Iraq posing a clear and present danger to the United States, which I think is what he's referring to. But you could also say that, like, again, if the stopping of genocide is a just cause of war, then that right there satisfies the just cause. Not necessarily just means or just in ends, but at least the just cause part might be satisfied. Just pointing that out there. I'm not saying it was or wasn't. You got to remember, even Israel back in that time was like, please don't go to war with Iraq. We don't want this. And the United States was like, gung ho, tally ho, like we're going to Iraq.
Of course, you've got the Afghanistan war. Aside from just the utter failure of trillions of dollars to replace the Taliban with more Taliban, WikiLeaks exposed how hundreds of government statements didn't match the evidence, with the Taliban's ability to mount an attack on the United States soil again being greatly exaggerated. And now here we are in the...
Well, I mean, the way that's not really how Islamic terrorism works. So Islamic terrorism also, like, often, especially nowadays, works on lone wolf attacks. So, yeah, true, the Taliban wouldn't be the ones to be able to wage that particular conflict, but, you would have to worry about people being from the United States, from a Western country actually performing the attack because they're actually here. But yeah, the whole war in Afghanistan was also another, like, floundering success, not success, but floundering defeat. There we go. And the reason why is because if you wanted success, this is the part where I was thinking of when I was talking a moment ago, so my fucking mouth wasn't moving correctly. If you wanted success, and I pointed this out when I was in the military, you would be attacking Islam constantly. You would be doing everything in your power to actually destroy Islam as a religious institution and then replace it with almost anything else, because almost anything else would cause a more stable setting than, you know, fucking warlord, conquer the world, everyone not Muslim is Dar al-Harb, the House of War, right? You know, someone else other than the day will not come until the Jew is hunted and hides behind a tree or a rock, and the tree and the rock will cry out, "O Muslim, servant of God, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him," except for the Garka tree, because that is the tree of the Jew, right? It's like, you can't really have peace in the Middle East with, you know, people who have a warlike religion, because it turns out, as much as warlike as people think the Viking religion was, it turns out despite them worshipping literal gods of war, they actually weren't as warlike as the Mohammedans. And you know, we didn't attack their religion. We actually tried to respect them. We didn't pay attention when the people in those regions were saying they want Sharia law. They just believed that the previous regimes were doing Sharia law wrong. So they still wanted the same system of government that made them miserable in the first place. So you couldn't, you know, supplant it with a more Western-style government, because they didn't want a Western-style government. But yeah, the WikiLeaks thing is also a good point. WikiLeaks has not yet had a single issue with false reporting so far, right? They have a damn near spotless track record on reporting what is actually going on, because all of their leaks are literally leaks of classified information, right? And it is quite enlightening to read some of the stuff that's actually available on their website. Yeah, so Afghan War Logs, an extraordinary secret compendium of over 91,000 reports covering the war in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2010. The reports describe the majority of lethal military actions involving the U.S. military.
The Iran War. The government spread propaganda and fear-mongering about most other wars in the last 100 years, but don't worry, this time they're totally telling the truth. Well, of course, this is a very large
Counterpoint, I have a 5-hour video on this exact topic. So again, if you want to learn more about the Iran war and why it might have been actually important, maybe watch the video where I literally review people who study very specific things that aren't actually attached to the United States government. And aren't attached to the British government, and actually thought that, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq were bad ideas, right? That this might be substantially different, because it turns out different countries are substantially different from each other. So anyway, let's go.
Simplification, and there's a lot more to these wars than I just mentioned, obviously. The problem is,
I also did a video talking about like what the dangers are, even if the war is justified. So I have a video on cults in the US government. That would also be another 5-hour video. If you could slog through that, it would also help to understand why I think it is also fine to worry about the Iran war, and whether or not like the people waging the war are actually doing so for a, you know, unjust means.
In each we can definitely objectively identify issues of exaggeration. And it doesn't really make sense why they would do this without taking into account the incentive structure that the military-industrial complex creates. Because when it comes to taxpayer dime, that's again a non-productive way to secure resources. If they were to go around and ask people to voluntarily fund these wars, they would be a lot more likely to question the information and justifications they were given, and of course there will be many conscientious objectors who will say no matter what. But in the case of taxation, the only thing they really have to fear is mass political unrest and mass protest, but ultimately those protesters are being forced to pay anyways. And so thus, they need to manufacture at least some base level of propaganda to exaggerate the threat. Even if the threat at a simple level is kind of real, they need to make it look big enough to avoid any kind of major issues. And this is true even...
Yeah, outside of war, they do this exact same kind of propagandistic fear-mongering for, like, actually privatizing the healthcare system, which we don't really do. We really do not. Or, you know, the same thing with Social Security. Like, why do you have Social Security? They played up that entire justification for the existence of Social Security and overblew whatever justifications were used to found it in the first place, which were false in the beginning, right? We already had answers to all those problems. Social Security actually rose to, you know, allegedly solve. They weren't real problems at the time. I'll do a video on that, because Mentis Wave has a really good video on that as well that I would like to have commentary on. Because, again, there's another video that came out recently that I compare with that into a single React video with 2 videos. and it'll express my frustration with some of these issues.
And for many of the politicians who aren't involved directly in the military-industrial complex. Because even if they personally aren't immediately profiting from this system, it's also just, in general, a good way to justify the existence of the non-productive class to the average normie. It basically is just another way to justify big government, and justify the ballooning debt. Another thing to their benefit is that taxation really kind of hides just how much money they're funneling into this. For example, think of just how completely insane any one of these would be if it was a private company that was trusted with security. Like, for example, imagine if Securitas told their customers that they need trillions of dollars of funding to protect them from some mysterious threat or some kind of cult that is planning to destroy everybody.
Oh yeah, no, very much so. The U.S. military is very wasteful in its spending, but like all government institutions are extremely wasteful in their spending because they're not subject to the same incentive structures and same competition as private entities are. So there's no real price gauging mechanism for these systems, and that's part of the reason why everything is more expensive than they should be. Anyone can take a look at like military spending in any government capacity and be like, why are you spending this much on the thing? Well, it's because, again, they don't really have a means of price negotiation with these systems because there is no real competition.
It's completely unthinkable. Nobody would even begin to consider that as a real claim. Everyone would look at them like they're completely bananas. Shareholders would immediately demand overwhelming evidence, without which all of them would pull out because it would be seen as deeply unserious. And if in a world where security is privatized, we did find out that a company just completely manufactured a war this way and wasted trillions of dollars to replace a threat with the same threat, and then leave them alone because, well, it turns out they're not that big of a threat anyway, over the course of 20 years, people would be calling that fraud on a massive scale. People would be demanding the head of that CEO to be placed on a pike because it's the government and they've effectively gaslit the population into believing that the non-productive class is necessary. The populace effectively suffers from a form of Stockholm syndrome, and thus justice for this massive scale fraud is never carried out. And so thus the error of James Lindsay in his reasoning here, it's just a really silly false comparison. Libertarians are blaming a criminal for doing a criminal act, and Lindsay is saying, oh, well, isn't that just exactly the same as these other people who falsely accused an innocent party or some random non-specific collective group for that crime? Therefore, the crime doesn't exist and libertarians are wrong. And well, no, we're not wrong because government officials have done this many times in the past. This is not a conspiracy theory, this is a statement of historical fact. And I know, I get it, a lot of times conservatives, general Republicans, they want to support our troops. They view that as being patriotic. But you have to consider, wouldn't it be more patriotic and more beneficial to your fellow Americans if when we went to war, we were going to war over legitimate things and not over exaggerated lies that get us into wars that aren't actually good and ultimately prove to not actually be defensive wars?
So I disagree with the whole, obviously the, whether or not the Iran war was actually considerable as defensive, because, if someone tells you they're going to kill you, hypothetically speaking, right, you're in a situation and someone tells you, like, straight faced, they're going to kill you. I am sorry, but the non-aggression principle does not prevent me from fucking decking the guy in the face and then kicking his ass, because it turns out I don't know if he's armed, right? I don't know what the fuck is going on. Like, as far as I'm concerned, I kind of think we should live in a society where it's like, if you threaten to kill someone, maybe that is a lethal force, initiating threat, right? Because again, I don't know if you're armed, right? I don't know if you're gonna pull a fucking knife on me, right? That is an escalation to lethal force because you're using coercion under threat of death to get a point, to do something. So I don't really think that's a violation of the non-aggression principle to hit first if someone threatens to hit you again first, because they began the coercion. They literally told you what they were going to do. And again, I have a whole 5-hour documentary on what was actually going on from people that are not incentivized the same way as the state government, right? People who don't have the same incentive structures. Their incentive structures are, in fact, that they don't want to see they don't want to see what Iran has been openly saying that they were trying to do actually happen. A lot of these people that I ended up talking about were, let's say, ex-Muslims, people who actually sat down and unlike the majority of people in Mises Institute, for example, which I love the Mises Institute. These people don't know shit about Islam. Like, none of these people have ever actually picked up a hadith and actually read the damn thing. Like, none of them could tell you anything about Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or Sahih al-Nisan, right? None of that shit. They couldn't tell you which one of the Sunnis or the Shias actually had the 4 books or the 5 books. None of this shit is like any of this. They might know something about, for example, the first Barbary Wars, and then not really, then that begs the question of why do we consistently have this same region, constantly touching our boats, right? Historically speaking. Well, turns out there's an answer to that, right? And yeah, so it's like we do have the issue of, like, again, reality is complex in that, like, people are not the same. So yeah, there's that. I don't think that the Afghanistan or the Iraq wars were really justified, for the most part. I think if there was any country we should have gone to war with, maybe the one that actually sent the fucking, the terrorist attacks might have been it, but, not the ones that had nothing to fucking do with it for the most part. But yeah. So yeah, the state does use money laundering, war for laundering funds and for massive fraud, and he is entirely right about this, right? Fraud has been going on in the state long before we found out anything in Minnesota. A lot of it was being conducted through the military as well, right? Again, we literally propped up what would become Al Qaeda during the Cold War, and then it came back to bite us in the ass, right? Yeah. But yeah, I could agree, for example, on the analysis for, like, Afghanistan and Iraq, but the analysis of the Iran situation is different because, yeah, most Iranians don't have the 12er ideology. That's fair. It doesn't matter who has the 12er ideology. It doesn't matter if the majority of Iranians have the 12er ideology. It only really matters if the people with the guns have the 12er ideology. And yeah. No, it turns out that, like, if you genuinely believe that the world to come is actually better than the world here, the way that you're going to apply your cost-benefit analysis is going to be different because you live in a different reality than the rest of us. And it turns out, again, your economic decisions are going to be different because your time preferences are going to be different based on the fact that, again, you believe the next world is superior to this world in goodness, and therefore you don't really care about this world. In fact, you want this world to be destroyed, much like the dispensationalists in the U.S. government, by the way. So it's not a distinctly Iranian thing. The Iranian, 12er wants the return of the Mahdi, and in order for that to happen, they have to maximize chaos, which is why they funded almost every terrorist group that, currently exists, and why they were, moving for nuclear weapons, even though, yeah, sure, Khomeini said that, may have said that nuclear weapons are haram, but I don't recall whether or not that there was any specific conditions to that, because sometimes religious organizations in Islam and historically Christianity will forbid an act of war against their own people, but not against the infidel, right? It's just historically a fact, right? So I would have to do a little bit more research into that, but they were very explicit about the the Iranian government was very explicit about wanting to get a nuclear weapon to maximize chaos by destroying, again, Israeli and American sites and their allies. But guess what? The dispensationalists want exactly that. The dispensationalists have been very open about wanting to cause nuclear war as well, because, again, they want to see the destruction of this world so that the Messiah can return, right? But we also have the same thing in the Chabad in Israel, right? Certain mystics in Chabad, which want to see the destruction of the world around us through the Samson doctrine for the purpose, again, of forcing the Messiah to come, to come for the first time, because they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. So you do have people in levers of power who want an excuse to maximize conflict, because they actually believe it's going to herald the end of this age and the birth of a new age. And it wasn't that hard to see that communists literally acted for this exact purpose, right? What do you think the whole point of returning to year zero is, right? The entire point of that is the destruction of this age to, come into the new age where all debts have been effectively, forgiven. So it doesn't matter what kind of debts you accrued in this world to create the next world. And I do think that sometimes we, in our economic analysis, we forget to consider that the economic analysis also extends to non-material things as well, such as how do I value my time in relation to whether or not I think this world is of primary importance or the next world is of primary importance. I think praxeologically speaking, we can still analyze this and it doesn't paint a very good picture. So again, whether or not you think the Iranian conflict is justified or not, the whole idea that, like, again, they weren't actually trying to make nukes and they were unable to make nukes is completely distinct from, again, any claims that Iraq actually had weapons of mass destruction. You know, these are different historical events. Sometimes there is overlap between different historical events, and sometimes there is an odd one out among historical patterns. This actually is one of those odd ones out. Did they have a nuke yet? No, but they were definitely trying to actually make something of a nuclear program for this specific purpose, and they weren't exactly shy about it, right? So this was definitely one of those things where it's like, this was going to devolve into a war whether we wanted to or not. I don't want it to. I don't want to see any fucking American boots on the ground. It's just, realistically speaking, even if we didn't have, you know, a crunchy conservative, you know, which is basically what Donald Trump is, in the White House, even if we had like a regular paleo conservative in the White House, this was eventually going to break into a large-scale, multi-continental conflict, again, because they did want the nukes. They were going to get the nukes, not because the people wanted the nukes, because the people in control who actually had the guns wanted the nukes. But anyway, that's also why they spent their people into a hyperinflation. As again, they don't really care about this world. They have an inordinate love of the next world.
Because we're not saying that war itself is always bad. Self-defense on a national level does make sense if it is actually a genuine threat. But you have to consider the issue of the non-productive class here and the incentives that they have to manufacture those threats. And
yeah, no, he does have a point here. Again, there is a real issue that even if this war is just, which it could be, it could also not be. It depends on what premises you're operating under. But let's just hypothetically state it is for a just cause. Well, it's also possible that, again, the means by which the war is waged actually undermines it. So even though the cause is just, because the means are malum in se, or evil in themselves, the war itself is discredited as an effort because the method by which the war is conducted is malum in se. And yeah, that's entirely possible, especially considering, again, the incentives of the productive class. You could make an argument that almost none of the modern age, the wars in the modern era are actually justified under just war principles. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. That's a debate for another time.
you can't deny them because we know, again, from historical fact, that they have indeed manufactured those threats. This is an objectively real problem that cannot be ignored. The government exaggerates threats in order to justify war, and many individual politicians and their allies can earn a profit off of it based on the structure of the system. You cannot deny that. That is a factually true statement. On that note, let's move on to statements of anarchy.
Once again, I actually think that this is a fair point to give Mentis. Like, again, I disagree with the specific example he's giving, but, again, even if it is a just war in cause, it could still be, you know, malum in se, in that the way it is conducted, including, for example, possibly a unjust method by which the war is potentially prolonged for, you know, again, the pursuit of profit, is a thing that could really play out. Or, for example, again, if the dispensationalists and the Chabadists are, you know, motivating the war, even if the war was, you know, just in its initial cause, it could be that the underlying incentives of dispensationalism and the Chabadist extreme Chabadist ideology in relation to war commanders could actually lead to situations where, again, the method by which it's carried out becomes malum in se, or, you know, the method of which the war is ended becomes malum in se. So yeah, this is a real concern. Even if the initial cause of the war is just, leave it to the state and the unproductive class to figure out a way to fuck it up forever, you know, to even when you're in the right of the conflict.
He writes, while Hoppe believes in a magical stateless society like the communists, the problem is short-term feasibility. The communists offer the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat, and the libertarian Hoppe recommends a monarchy, lol. So this is another kind of common misconception with Hoppe, people thinking he's a monarchist, mainly because it's mostly false, but not entirely false. Hoppe was more or less just arguing that monarchy is better than democracy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you believe that monarchy is good. However, there are elements of monarchy that do kind of jive a little bit more with libertarian theory than what you would normally expect.
I kind of want to read this. All right. So, despite the comparatively favorable portrait presented of monarchy, I am not a monarchist, and the following is not a defense of monarchy. Instead, the position taken towards monarchy is this. If one... Okay, well, that's... Yeah, it's just the I am not a monarchist part is highlighted. And yeah, I'm pretty sure I already know where he's going about this, right? But yeah, because there is a libertarian monarchist, I think, in the Red Veil community. Talked to the guy before. Strange guy, but, you know.
Do kind of jive a little bit more with libertarian theory than what you would normally expect. There are similarities to it, and that's why I've personally said in the past why libertarian monarchy as an actual ideology isn't that bad, or at the very least, it's better than the current status quo. I recall...
Oh yeah, no, libertarian monarchists are actually fairly harmless people. They actually are not nearly as deranged as some people seem to think they are. Like, Liechtenstein is an example of, like, a setting that they would give as, like, an approximate. It's not exactly what they want, but it's, like, an approximate of what the hell they're talking about, right?
I did a tier list where I personally ranked it in one of the higher tiers of political ideologies. And the reason for that actually has a little bit to do with the first part of what Lindsay gets incorrect here, which is thinking that the idea of a stateless society, as the Austrian school might propose it, is similar in any way to what the communists propose, when it is absolutely not. The issue here comes down to how they define the state. Leftists and communists, they define statism as really just the existence of authority in any kind of hierarchical structure. And so thus their big thing is that they oppose hierarchies, and that's how they consider themselves to be anarchists. Whereas the Austrian school more or less defines the state as simply being against aggression, or in other words, the abolition of the non-productive class. And so thus, in that system, hierarchy and authority and general rule of law are all considered good things, actually, so long as the citizens of a nation are voluntarily funding them. Like, for example, Hoppe defines a state as an agency that exercises a compulsory territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making, jurisdiction, and of taxation. And you'll also notice how he's also saying in pretty much the exact same paragraph, I am not a monarchist. So, Democracy, the God That Failed, this book is not supposed to be a book that defends monarchy. It's just using the argument that monarchy is better than democracy, and why it's better than democracy, to critique democracy. But this does not mean that monarchy is ideal. So why is it then that monarchy is seen somewhat closer to the libertarian theory than democracy? And well, there's a lot of reasons why, but one thing that needs to be pointed out is that it again just kind of boils down to the non-productive class. In fact, I would personally define a state as a territorial monopoly under the thumb of a non-productive class. That would probably make things a bit more consistent. Although Hoppe does imply that by saying taxation, it's pretty easy to get confused. Now, a monarchy is still a system where you have a non-productive class. In fact, in many ways, that's what a king is. The king gets to extract resources.
To be fair, Take History also had an issue with, like, anarcho-capitalism because of, again, the way they define state. Yeah, this is just one of those things you find in libertarianism on occasion, is that sometimes the words don't necessarily mean the thing you initially expect if you come from, like, a conservative background. And sometimes this is because there's been a lot more philology or, like, work being put in to define things to make it clear in conversation what they're saying. But in order for that to actually be clear, you have to be familiar with the language. So this is not in the same way as, like, the communists do, where they use language to equivocate and obfuscate. The technical language in libertarianism, while sometimes confusing, is actually meant to clarify. So once you understand what is meant, then you can get a pretty solid grasp when you are listening to two libertarians talk, or three libertarians talk, what the hell they're having a conversation about, even if they're using terms in a way that might be a little confusing at times like this. But that's just because, again, it's a way to speak based off of it. You know, all philosophies do this, right? There's like the Aristotelians and the Cartesians use the same words oftentimes in very different ways, and ways that don't necessarily make intuitive sense unless you're familiar with the body of work that precedes it, which is the same thing which goes on in, like, libertarian thought with how some of these terms are defined.
resources from other people's work, regardless of whether or not they want to. So that's still considered a non-productive class and still bad. The main difference, though, and the reason Hoppe kind of argues for democracy being worse than monarchy, has to do with how that non-productive class is owned. In the case of monarchy, the non-productive class, the state, is under private ownership, and under democracy, it's under public ownership. And a lot of people will think about it and immediately assume, well, okay, well, if there is a non-productive class, wouldn't it be better for us all to be owners of it? And the answer is absolutely not.
Yeah, that's a stupid like question, because again, you have to have some kind of decision maker with regards to property, right? Using the example of like a shovel. Like the issue with property is that, like, if one person is using it in one way, then it's not being used in another way by another person who could in theory be using it. And this is ultimately, this exclusionary principle is fundamentally the basis of property rights. It's also the reason why, for example, intellectual property does not actually exist. It's a legal fiction. The legal fiction enforced by thugs in order to make sure that, again, certain people do not actually have to work like the rest of us. They can actually parasitize off of other people. Again, it's that non-productive class thing, right? When historically speaking, ideas were able to be remixed and reimagined all the time. Think about like how common it is to find a painter in history who's done their own interpretation of the sower, right? So no one had an intellectual property right claim on the sower.
Actually, one of the big mistakes of the modern day, because there is no such thing as collective ownership. There is no collective mind. There is just individual positions occupying temporarily the non-productive class.
This is another thing that I think people will get confused on, is like the libertarian position is not against hierarchy. There is actually an implicit understanding of hierarchy under libertarianism, because again, like, libertarians believe in free market economics, which is intrinsically hierarchical, right? Like the employer exists above on the hierarchy, the employee by necessity. But it's not, not as an overlord, but as a mutual, just like a mutual benefactor. Like the employer commands the employee, and they both benefit from it by actually having the business run smoothly, right? So yeah, no, like, again, hierarchy is baked into libertarianism. You want to understand the libertarian concept of the family? Well, again, the father and mother have the hierarchical position over the children, right? Because the children aren't rational agents. They don't actually have a rational capacity up until a certain point. So then the decisions get to be made by the individuals who actually have a rational capacity. So yeah, hierarchy is just like intrinsically built into libertarianism. It's just a more sophisticated understanding of hierarchy based off of, again, a conception of, again, man ultimately owns himself. Like, no one else owns man. And man owns himself necessarily. There's no other way that it could be. And that, like, his body is fundamentally his, right? But yeah, anyway. So ownership is kind of the basis of libertarianism. Even like the whole idea of like your body being your own property, that's kind of logically required. It would make no sense if your body wasn't your own property.
It's tens of thousands of politicians who may or may not care about what the public thinks. Of course, they'll all say that they care, but they don't necessarily need to. And the issue with that really just comes down to two things: incentives and time preference.
This is a fucking hysterical meme. But I didn't vote for this, cried the citizen. Lol, said the appointed official. Lamau.
A king has an actual greater incentive to ensure the functioning system of his kingdom lasts the length of his rule, and if it's a decent king, probably so that it will also last up to his dynasty. So that way the kingdom will remain a decent kingdom, a nice place to live for his children, who will also one day rule and take on the position of king. Or at least
this is a kind of, right? Like the whole neutrality that Queen Elizabeth ruled with, for example, was based off of the, again, incentives that, you needed to keep your position of power, right? And many monarchies collapsed under the First and Second World War, right? So the whole idea is like, oh yeah, this is actually a fragile arrangement. I don't want to necessarily poke this particular situation too much. So, like, I mean, think about like what happened with like Tsar Nikolai II, right? He wanted to try to ensure that things were actually running smoothly, and then the Russian, the Red Army paid him back by trying to democratize, because he wasn't giving up the throne, but he was trying to give the people a bigger say in what actually happened, and the Red Army then decided to stab him in the back for, again, trying to democratize by murdering his entire family, right? These are the communists. These are the people who claim to be the good people, actually, right? And it's funny enough. Who is this actually that they're showing? I don't think this is the Tsar, but so it's like that informed the rule of Queen Elizabeth II. The idea that, again, the regent has an obligation to the subject, and the subject has an obligation to the regent, but the regent should be minimal in their government of the governing of the society. Now, granted, considering Starmer and a couple of other things that are going on, the neutrality is definitely being put in a lesser light right now than, when she was in reign, because some of the stuff happened under her reign. So, pick your poison, right? But, yeah, King Charles, for example, it doesn't seem to care about the longevity of the crown because, intrinsically speaking, he doesn't believe in the legitimacy of his own position. So a lot of his decision making kind of makes sense when you realize that King Charles doesn't seem to believe that the monarchy is a legitimate institution, and so he's not acting in such a way that would presumably preserve the monarchy longer into the future. I'm not the first person to notice this. There's been other people who seem to have noticed that King Charles doesn't seem to view his position as the supreme governor of the Church of England or the monarch of the Commonwealth nations or Commonwealth of Nations, actually, as a legitimate position. And consequently, this could have problems if things get significantly worse in the United Kingdom. So
that's how it goes to the individual incentive of the king. I mean, just put yourself in the shoes of one. If you are a king of a great nation, and you one day want to pass on this great nation to your son, well, that alone is a pretty big immediate incentive to make sure that you rule as a decent king. But politicians are different. Politicians get voted in through a temporary measure to occupy that position for 4 years or so. And so their incentive from a personal level is to take advantage of that position that they've been temporarily granted, which means that they actually have less of an incentive to spend resources rationally.
Funny enough, this was actually, I think, Aristotle. One of the criticisms that Aristotle made of democracy, right, was the perverse incentives that are intrinsic in a democratic system, right? So yeah, this is something that people have known about since literally the time of the ancient Greeks, right? Excuse me. He also had some interesting things to say about rulers who preferred the foreigner over their own people, right? Just looking at, again, King Charles and thinking, kind of interesting, right? I wonder if that pattern is going to hold. But
thing just comes down to corruption and being able to tell who specifically is at fault for the corruption. In a monarchy, you have significantly lower amounts of unelected, sort of unaccountable bureaucrats. Whereas in the public ownership of the non-productive class, you could have millions of them. And so you have no idea whenever you see corruption who exactly very specifically is at fault for the corruption without digging through miles of paperwork and through trudging through various connections within the power structures to see who actually is at fault for a problem. Whereas with...
Well, I mean, to be fair, this is by design to avoid accountability, right? This is a system that exists to, again, prop up the parasitic class while punishing the productive class. So
with a monarchy, it's a lot easier. A lot of times the problem when a nation is failing can just be directly blamed on the king in a monarchy situation, or at the very least it can be blamed on his closest advisors. And how this all relates to libertarian theory is that monarchy is just a little bit closer, because in the case of a libertarian society, say a libertarian nation, where there is no non-productive class, then you have privatization, but privatization of necessary government features such as defense and the courts, etc., etc. And it just so happens that that is a little bit more similar to how monarchy functions rather than democracy. And so, for example, one kind of libertarian society that could potentially exist in the future is a privately owned space colony, where you have this large, artificial, technologically advanced rotating habitat. And this colony would effectively operate as a massive homeowners association. People who wanted to live there would pay for a plot of land within the habitat and agree to certain rules in order to keep the peace. The key thing here is that because they want to live there and they see the price tag of living there, it is a voluntary exchange. And so thus, in this case, the private owner or the CEO of this futuristic habitat, they don't own the people. The people living there are not his slaves. Rather, instead, they become customers. If he doesn't ensure that his colony is a nice place to live, then people will leave, or they just won't want to live there in the first place, and it would no longer be financially sustainable. And libertarians argue that this is effectively the best way for these societies to actually work, effectively drafting a sort of pseudo-constitution and a rule of law based around the NAP and free market capitalism. Which then brings me to a bonus refutation.
I mean, especially in the case with like a space colony or seasteading, it's literally the only way you could actually have such a society function. Like, unfucking ironically, right? That's like, what would be the worst place to have a communist style like incursion into your society? Would be a fucking seastead or a space colony. Good lord, man, right? But yeah, nah, the more he described that, I'm like, I want to live in that society, to be perfectly honest. I want to live in that capitalist, constitutional capitalist fucking space station. Like, I will live in the inner or the outer ring. I don't really care which one. Just keep on rotating, I guess, right? Oh my god. The moon is a harsh mistress, right? Great, great book.
A lot of standard conservatives, one of the contentions they have with libertarianism is that they think that libertarianism requires people to just. Like this one right here. Lone criticism, LMAO. Libertarianism is a child's ideology. Every belief they have is centered on if people would just, aka make believe. And if that was true, then yes, that would be a big problem. The people are not going to just. Any ideology or concept of a society that requires, oh well, what if all the people would just magically get along with each other? Well, yeah, that's obviously not going to work. You need to give people an incentive to do so, which is why pretty much every functioning civilization, or really just any kind of functioning organization, has rules and punishments for breaking those rules. Like, for example, your job. If you don't do your job, or if you do certain things wrong at your job, you get fired. At least assuming that you have a standard 9-to-5 job. But if you don't, that's kind of how it works. It's a private organization, and it works by something called freedom of association. Your job, the place that you work at, chooses to associate with you because you offer them some kind of benefit. You perform a certain task for them. And if you don't do it, they have no reason to pay you. And they have no reason to allow you to stay there on the premises. And the thing is, that's kind of effectively how libertarian theory works. I've said this before on my video on left anarchy. In terms of right anarchy, in the very different way that right anarchy is defined, as just being against a non-productive class, that doesn't necessarily mean no rules. There's still going to be rules and an incentive structure and a rule of law. It's just different in how it functions, with one of the big differences being that freedom of association is largely used, and so one of the big punishments you'll see is banishment. So for instance, returning to the example,
absolutely based, right? Get off my property, right? What if I don't? Hold on. Okay, maybe I shouldn't use that joke. I could just rack my shotgun to be recorded, but I'm like, wait a minute. That might actually get my video flagged. You know what? Fuck it. I'll do it anyway. Let's see if it actually works. You're banished. Get off my property. Let's see if that actually caught. I don't know if that actually caught, but hopefully.
Of a futuristic space colony. If somebody moves in agreeing to live by the rule of peace and the nap, and then the first thing they do is murder their neighbor, well, ultimately that colony is going to have some kind of adjudication committee. And considering the extreme nature of their crime, the punishment can simply be getting yeeted out of the colony, spacesuit optional. Or perhaps for a less severe crime, it could also just simply be them not renewing their lease. A privately owned review board could look at what they did while they were a member of the colony, reach the conclusion that they were not a very good addition to, let's just say, refusing to clean up after their dog, and so thus they don't renew their lease. Towards the end, you now have to move out and find a different colony to live in, perhaps one that doesn't care if people pick up after their dog or not, and so thus the less pleasant people to be around will ultimately in this society find themselves surrounded with others like themselves. And that's just one of the many incentives by which people have to actually be decent people. It's not requiring everyone to just, purely by the goodness of their own heart. If you don't follow the nap in a libertarian society, you get shown the door. That's how it works. But
I mean, you don't follow the NAP, the non-aggression principle, in a libertarian society. You don't necessarily just get shown the door. Again, because the NAP just defines when violence is acceptable, right? You violate the NAP and it becomes violence time. Just pointing that out there, right? Violating the NAP could be a potential way of getting your ass shot in a libertarian society, to be perfectly honest. Which I'm not necessarily opposed to, right? I think, for example, if you try to break into someone's house and like, hey, there's an asymmetry of knowledge, you know what you're trying to do. I don't know what the hell you're trying to do. I don't know what you're trying to do to the people in the house, right? So I don't know why I shouldn't be able to just fucking smoke your ass and just like send you to heaven with same-day delivery, right? Just, why shouldn't I have that capacity, right? If you're breaking into my my abode, it just don't make no sense. So, yeah, violence is not a thing that wouldn't exist in a libertarian society. It would just be something that would be a highly regulated and highly, what would you say, moral section of libertarian society. Because it would be a increased focus on when to and not to initiate force. So that doesn't mean there is no force. That just means that, again, there would be an understanding of context, an appropriate context to use force. And I've never really heard very many people actually give a good argument against the non-aggression principle that doesn't actually make them look like the bad person in that situation, to be perfectly honest, right? Even the people who try to make shit up about it, it's like, nah, it's like, if you say you're gonna kill me and then like I have reason to believe that that is a thing you could do, yeah, I could just fucking, again, you're the one who initiated force, you're the one who made the threat, you're the one who tried to use coercive, you know, the coercion of death upon me. Yeah, I don't exactly see why I couldn't respond in kind in that particular situation, right? Just pointing that out there. It does seem that like a large part of the contingent of people who criticize the non-aggression principle, they have ulterior motives for criticizing the non-aggression principle oftentimes.
anyway, going back to James Lindsay, I'll just end it on this post from him, criticizing the American Libertarian movement and party for getting captured by leftists some time ago. He said they aren't actually principled, they're useful idiots, most of the principled people left and discussed over the last decade. Now, this statement from Lindsay is actually partially correct. One problem with the Libertarian Party is that it's kind of in a bad position politically. A big difference between Republicans and Democrats and the Libertarian Party is that Republicans and Democrats are really just political parties that are masquerading as philosophies, whereas Libertarianism is an actual philosophy that's trying to find its place as a political party. And because of this, as well as the fact that it's kind of a small party, it opens the doors to a lot of what you could call pragmatism. However, comparing that to the two major parties, well, both Democrats and Republicans are inherently pragmatic. They don't actually believe in anything at all, which is far worse considering that they're parties that have some actual power behind them. But as far as what Lindsay points out here as leftists taking over the libertarian movement, that is very much untrue, or...
Alright, gonna pause this so we can read this. If you haven't figured it out, both parties will spy on you. That's true. Both parties will start illegal wars. They have both done that, yes. Both parties are owned by banks. The banks themselves are owned by payment processors, so it goes even worse than that. Let's see. Both parties will continue the drug war. That is also true. Neither one really wants to stop it because they both benefit from it. Both parties are slaves to corporations. This is true. And both parties will continue the police state. This is also true. Again, that's why it's called the uniparty, right?
out here as leftists taking over the libertarian movement. That is very much untrue, or to be specific, it's kind of behind the curve of time. If you were to say that in the time of Gary Johnson or something, then yeah, admittedly, that might be a little true. But
yeah, Gary Bake the Cake Johnson. Yeah, no, that would have absolutely been true. And part of it is, again, the error of letting dialectical thinking inside the libertarian movement, which is a hallmark of mostly left libertarianism. Right libertarians don't tend to think in this dialectical framework. And that's why they don't end up becoming like stands for tankies. But yeah, so which is, you know, again, you have dialectical thought in the conservative side too, but you also have dialectical thinking in the libertarian side. And it's interesting that, like, again, when the dialectical thinking push comes to shove, they end up acting like leftists, because it turns out the problem with leftism is the dialectical thinking.
since the failure of what you could call left pragmatism, the libertarian movement, if anything, has a lot more GOP pragmatism. And I think what's happening here is that Lindsay is not only behind the curve, but I think he's just kind of basing this entirely on opposition to the Iran war. Just because libertarians and a lot of Democrats right now are both against the Iran war, that doesn't mean that libertarians have suddenly become leftists. In fact,
yeah, I mean, that would make sense. Like, if libertarianism is not conservatism, then they're obviously going to disagree on things, right? That shouldn't be that hard to understand. It's like, if you have two different, if you have ideology, if you have idea A, B, and C, and A and C and A and B don't agree with each other, but C isn't identical to A or B, then it is very easily envisionable that there are times where it will agree with A and times where it will agree with B, which then will ultimately end up with it being accused of being like never actually working against side A by, you know, side B, and then never working against side B by side A. Oh wait, yes, I fucking mentioned this earlier again, where I was told on multiple occasions by both sides of the aisle that, oh, you're a libertarian, you'd never oppose the Democrats, or oh, the libertarians would never oppose the Republicans. Again, no, this is a real thing that some of us have to deal with. It's like, motherfucker, I am not a like Republican. Just just flat out, I am not a conservative Republican. Of course, I'm going to disagree with you at times, and a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So yeah, sure, maybe there is 1 or 2 points that are maybe made by people I don't particularly like, but they're still valid points because they're actually true. They actually correspond to reality. And like, if I did agree with you on all points, guess what? I would be in your like ideological group. This isn't that hard to understand. But a lot of people, especially like the as mentioned earlier, the whole claim that like, oh yeah, it's the teenagers' ideology. Again, it's the same thing we're having with the James Lindsay thing right now, where it's none of these people have actually picked up or read Hoppe or actually read Ayn Rand or read any of these people, right? If anything, it's like, oh yeah, well, I read that book. No, you didn't. You skimmed it at best. You did the thing Mujin did with this fucking Cinder document, right? Where you read it, but you weren't actually thinking about it when you were reading it, so you don't actually have any deeper understanding of the thing that you don't believe in, right? Which is not that hard. It's not that hard to have a deeper understanding of a worldview you don't believe in. And again, the fact that it's like, okay, you may have read these books, but you don't understand the basics of them, indicates that, again, you didn't think about it very much, right? Assuming that you even read these books in the first place and didn't just LARP about it. So anyway.
ironically, it's exactly the opposite of this accusation here. Being against the Iran war entirely comes from a place of being principled. It's recognizing that the US unfortunately does have a history that needs to be acknowledged of exaggerating crimes in order to justify war, and that they take advantage of the fact that they can fund it through the non-productive class, and then when it turns out that they're lying, they don't get held accountable. We libertarians haven't really changed our position on this at all. In fact, what we're seeing right now is really the consequences of ignoring what the Mises Caucus had to say about funding unlimited taxpayer dollars to Israel, and how giving Tel Aviv and Netanyahu and co. a blank check on United States taxpayer dime was not actually incentivizing them to de-escalate the situation anytime soon. This was back when Biden was in charge. And now we are...
They are correct about this. Again, I don't support almost any foreign aid at all anyway. My money shouldn't be going to fucking Britbonger, shouldn't be going to Israel, shouldn't be going to fucking Taiwan, shouldn't be going to any of these places. Just point of fact, right? Yes, sure, geopolitically speaking, there are reasons to be invested in region A and region B. Like, there's a reason to be invested in Taiwan in the fact that, like, again, they produce the majority of the world's computer chips, which should be an incentivizing principle to encourage computer chip production in the fucking United States. But anyway, that's besides the point. Anyway, so let's read this. Socialism Israel style. In his treatise, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, Hans Hermann Hoppe lays the theoretical foundations for the understanding and identifying the phenomenon of socialism, not as a mere invention of the Marxist of the 19th century, but as a much older idea of the institutionalized interference with or aggression against private property and private property claims. Then Hoppe holds the institution of the state as the very incorporation of socialist ideas on property, and expresses the idea that the state is indeed the very institution that puts socialism into action. That is true. And as socialism rests on aggressive violence directed against innocent victims, aggression is the nature of any state. I would agree with this. The opposite of socialism is the recognition and defense of private property rights, or as Hans Hoppe writes, a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners, whether in land or in anything else. Private property are justly assigned to specific individuals on the basis of original appropriation or voluntary property transfer. All claims to property okay, I can't read that part because Mentis is in the way, so I guess this is where we end this particular reading.
We're just seeing the consequences of that. Unless you want to argue that being against war is somehow a quote-unquote leftist principle, this is kind of a nonsensical argument, and trust me, that's not something you want to give to the left. Because leftists are absolutely not principled at all. Heck, the only real reason that they're against the war is simply because Trump's in office and Orange Man bad. They don't actually understand anything. I mean, let's be real for a minute here. Rather, the leftist anti-war mentality largely comes from a place of third worldist thinking, where they blame the fact that the third world is poor on imperialism from the first world, and so thus they tend to oppose a lot of wars based on that misguided thinking.
Despite the fact that, again, a lot of these places only have the kind of wealth that they actually do because of sometimes the intervention of the colonial powers. Now, granted, not all of them, right? But yeah, some of these places only are able to achieve certain things because of the intervention of those first, of those European colonial powers. Just saying. And, again, colonization isn't always bad, right? I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize to the Indian for the ending of the practice of sati by the British. Not going to do it. Fuck off, right? Absolutely not.
However, say that the libertarian movement...
Or, again, another example, no, I'm not going to apologize to the Central American that, like, the Spanish fucking took over, or the Triple Alliance, and then protected, to stop the genocide of native peoples by the Nahua, and then ended up trying to protect the Nahua from being revenge genocided by the people that they were oppressing, right? No, absolutely not. Fuck off. A lot of these colonization efforts were absolutely, not nearly as villainous as many pseudo historians who won't actually read the first-hand documentation actually say.
Does need to think about strategy a bit more, but it's specifically a way of how we can have strategy while still being principled, which will be a video for another day. But for now, that is all. Hopefully I've cleared some of the things up that James Lindsay had to say. TLDR, it's pretty much just an issue of you gotta actually read the entire essay, you gotta actually read Democracy, the God That Failed, and also for gaining a further understanding as to why the libertarian movement is not a left-wing movement, you could also read Hans Hermann Hoppe on getting libertarianism right. The point of this video was really to just give a TLDR of all of those things. But for now, that's all. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and if you want to support me, you can either tip me on Ko-Fi, or you can support me on Subscribestar or by becoming a member of the channel. But for now, that is all. Till next time.
Oh, man. Yeah. James Lindsay did not do himself any favors with this, especially that part where it's like, oh, yeah, see this exact structural parallel? It's like, yeah, I mean, in some cases it would be true, especially like if you're talking about like a genealogical relationship and you're trying to show a genealogical relationship between idea A and idea B. But the way you're doing this, my guy, doesn't make any sense because, again, libertarianism is like completely antithetical to all the things you literally highlighted as an example. Like, even if it is structurally similar, they don't operate at all outside of that in the same way. Like, they have opposite assumptions, kind of like the thing we saw earlier where it's like Hoppe would just grant the Marxist the principle and not the principle, but like the fact, and then show how that fact still doesn't imply communism, right? So it's like that. But I mean, you could very easily do the exact same thing with like his entire worldview. You could actually just argue, and I've seen people do this, that his entire worldview is self-defeating because it implies the very thing that he's trying to fight against. And it's like, I mean, kind of, if you really stretched it outside of what he's trying to do, because what he's doing is like just allegedly before he fell off, by the way, right before he fell off, like he's just trying to apply the Vogelinian analysis to modern ideologies as they exist now. And you could, I guess, say the same thing about like how Eric Vogelin did his analysis, but the thing is again, it doesn't really match because you have to ignore really important details in order to get that to work, such as, for example, how their entire point is about this whole idea of a special cognition that belongs to a particular enlightened class, but libertarianism does, but like the Vogelinian perspective doesn't actually believe in this enlightened idea. Like, anyone can literally read a book and then draw these comparisons themselves. You don't actually have to be enlightened or have any kind of special cognition to understand these connections. Whereas like the whole point of like Marxists saying you don't get it kind of deal is that, again, you don't actually have the special class consciousness, right? So it seems to be similar on the surface, but like when you actually burrow down to the essential components, they're actually not the same. And yeah, it's the same thing with libertarianism. Even if you granted Lindsay the thing at the beginning, it's like, yeah, what does that mean? They're fundamentally different too, because it's like a lot of the, I guess we just saw, you're missing all this context that actually shows that they are completely unrelated, in fact, antithetical ideologies. But anyway, so yeah, this is disappointing. Again, James Lindsay has done real good work, but he has let himself see communists in his soup, to be perfectly honest. Which was a thing I was definitely worried about for a time before I had to tell myself, is like, hey, not everything actually is communism. And sometimes a thing that looks like Gnosticism isn't actually Gnosticism, even if it looks like it. You have to actually look into it and see what precisely is actually true about that thing before you make that delineation. But yeah, so I can understand the danger of overgeneralizing a epistemological lens. I was definitely worried about that for like 6 months when I first started learning about all of this stuff. So it is sad to see that James Lindsay just has refused to try to actually interface with libertarianism in any real way. But it's not exactly an uncommon thing to do, right? People don't want to interface with libertarianism, partly because, let's be fair, certain libertarians don't exactly make themselves look good. But at the same time, even the ones that are actually really solid, like libertarians, libertarianism requires a lot of what would you say, genuine commitment to a moral and ethical life. Yeah. I guess I can't really think of anything to say outside of padding for this video. So y'all have a lovely day, and remember, in the midst of It's So Over, we will find our We're So Back.